Recall. It records everything that appears on the screen of your computer. Oh, that's it. Windows Recall takes screenshots, they call them snapshots, of whatever it is that you're doing on your PC every few seconds, and then feeds them through AI-assisted optical text recognition and image analysis, then stores it all in a local database for your convenience. And they only need 10% of your hard drive space to do it?
In May 2025, Signal, the encrypted messaging app used by journalists, activists, military personnel, and anyone whose communications carry real risk, updated its software to block a feature built into Microsoft Windows. The feature was called Recall, and Signal's response to it was, in their words, the only option they had. At that point, Microsoft was one of the most valuable companies in the history of publicly traded markets. Its CEO had spent years positioning the company as a leader in responsible AI. It had assigned the equivalent of 34,000 full-time engineers to security work, more dedicated security personnel than most organizations on Earth employ in total. And a privacy-focused messaging app had concluded, after examining what Microsoft built, that the only responsible response was a hard block. I've been trying to understand how that happened, not in the sense of assigning blame. That's the easy version of this story, and it isn't the useful one. But in the sense of understanding what kind of system produces that outcome. What decisions, made by reasonable people in reasonable rooms, get you from there to here? That question, why Signal had no other option, is what this video is actually about. To understand why Recall exists at all, you need to understand who Satya Nadella is. Nadella took over Microsoft in 2014, when the company was widely seen as a slow-moving giant that had missed mobile, missed search, and was missing cloud. What he did over the following decade was not a turnaround story in the conventional sense. It was a restructuring of what Microsoft believed it was for. He is not a person who makes obvious mistakes. The people who have worked with him describe someone who reads the room extraordinarily well, who understands what the market is ready for before the market knows it, who positions Microsoft not as the company that invented something, but as the company that made it viable at scale. Cloud, Teams, LinkedIn, Azure, each of these was a bet on a direction of travel that, in retrospect, seems obvious. At the time, it required someone looking at the same information as everyone else and drawing a different conclusion. By 2024, that instinct had landed on AI, specifically AI that runs on your device, using your data, personalized to you in ways that cloud-based AI can't replicate. The pitch was compelling, the vision was coherent, and the feature chosen to demonstrate it was Recall. To understand how Recall got built the way it did, you need to follow that. Someone looked at this and said yes. The question is, what room they were in when they said it. Yusuf Mehdi announced Recall on May 20th, 2024.
With Recall, we're going to leverage the power of AI and the new system performance to make it possible to access virtually anything you have ever seen on your PC. It's going to be, honestly, as if you have photographic memory.
The pitch was elegant. Windows would take a screenshot of your screen every few seconds. It would convert those images into searchable text. It would index everything, documents, websites, emails, messages, so that you could search your own digital past the way you search the web. Mehdi called it a photographic memory for your computer. He said the data was private, local, and secure. 24 hours later, Kevin Beaumont published his analysis. Beaumont was not an unknown critic. He was a veteran security researcher with a long track record of being correct before institutions caught up. His piece was titled, "This feature fundamentally undermines Windows security." His argument was precise. The screenshots Recall took were being stored in a database that used a standard file format, one that any software on the machine could open. That software didn't need special access. It didn't need to bypass security systems. It needed the same basic level of access that any regular application has. The logbook of everything you'd ever done on your computer was sitting in a format readable by anything running on the machine. 2 days after the announcement, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office opened an inquiry. The ICO does not move that fast on most things. The speed of that response was itself a signal about how the feature read to people who assess privacy risk professionally. By May 31st, Beaumont had gone further. He'd tested a proof-of-concept extraction tool. The result, 2 lines of code. That was the entirety of what you needed to pull the Recall database from a running Windows machine. In June, James Forshaw at Google's dedicated security team published a separate finding. The database could be accessed without administrator access at all. Standard user permissions were enough. Microsoft moved the launch. The original June date became a delay, then a phased rollout, then a restructured approach. The cascade took 18 days from announcement to the first delay decision. The security problems with the original recall weren't just about hackers getting in from outside. They were about what recall did to the trust architecture that already existed inside Windows. Signal is the clearest example of this. Signal is built on a specific technical and philosophical premise that the contents of your messages should be readable only by the people in the conversation, not by Signal, not by the platform, not by anyone who might gain access to the device later. To make this real, Signal encrypts messages end-to-end, so that even if someone intercepts them in transit, they get noise, not content. This works because of where the protection ends. At the moment, a message is read on your screen. Recall captured screens, which means Recall captured the moment after Signal's encryption had done its job. The message, decrypted and displayed, was exactly what Recall was designed to index. Signal's response was to use a tool that would let developers tell Windows, "Don't capture me," a mechanism that allows apps to mark their windows as excluded from screen capture, and it worked in the sense that Recall respected it. But Signal's developer, Joshua Lund, wrote about why this was not a solution they could accept. The problem wasn't just that Recall could capture Signal windows. The problem was that this exclusion mechanism only worked for apps that knew about it and implemented it. An attacker who wanted to capture Signal messages didn't need to break Signal's encryption. They needed to capture a different Signal adjacent window, a notification, a preview, anything that displayed content before the DRM flag was applied. Lund called it one weird trick. The implication was clear. The security was real in the common case and fragile in the adversarial one. For Signal's users, journalists, activists, people in genuinely dangerous situations, the common case is not the case that matters. Brave, the privacy-focused browser, added a similar block in the weeks that followed. AdGuard, a tool used to block ads and trackers, blocked Recall from capturing its windows by default. None of these were small or niche products. They were tools built by organizations that had spent years thinking carefully about what data exposure means and who it affects. And each of them independently looked at Recall and concluded the right response was a hard block, not a setting. Then, in December 2025, something quieter happened. Microsoft published documentation for enterprise customers, the IT administrators who manage Windows deployments in large organizations, describing how Recall would behave in managed environments. The documentation noted that on managed devices, Recall would not be enabled by default, not disabled, not opt-in, removed. The implication was significant. The same feature that had been described to consumers as private, local, and secure was being delivered to enterprise environments with a different default, one that assumed the people responsible for organizational security would not want it running. The enterprise confession said, without saying it, the people who manage security at scale looked at this feature and turned it off. In April 2026, a researcher named Alexander Hegener returned to Recall with a new tool and a finding that reframes everything that came before it. In the year Recall launched, Microsoft committed $80 billion to AI infrastructure, data centers, chips, compute capacity. $80 billion in a single fiscal year. That is not a product decision, that is a declaration. The next decade of computing would be defined by AI, and the companies that owned the hardware layer would own everything above it. Microsoft wanted to own the hardware layer. And to justify that, to hardware partners, to investors, to the market, they needed to show that AI on a PC could do something genuinely new, something you couldn't do on a phone or in a browser. Recall was that demonstration. So when Recall had to be delayed, the consequences weren't just reputational. Copilot Plus PCs, the new class of AI-native hardware that partners like Dell and Samsung and Lenovo had built entire product lines around, launched without its headline feature. The machines shipped. The feature did not. Microsoft rebuilt anyway. What they built was genuinely serious. The screenshots were now encrypted, locked in a format that couldn't be read without your face or your fingerprint to unlock them, verified through Windows Hello every time. The processing happened in a locked-off section of memory that other software on the machine couldn't reach. Even if someone found a way in, a deliberate throttle meant they couldn't pull everything at once. Gavin Beaumont, The researcher who had titled his original analysis, "This fundamentally undermines Windows security," wrote that Microsoft had made serious efforts. From him, that meant something. The rebuilt version shipped as opt-in, requiring explicit setup. By most assessments, the container it built around your data was strong. Then, in April 2026, a researcher named Alexander Hagener came back to it. Hagener had built one of the first tools that demonstrated in the early months how easy the original version was to exploit. He returned to the rebuilt version with the same forensic attention. And what he found was not that the vault had failed. What he found was that the vault ended too soon. The encryption was real. The authentication was real. The locked-off memory was real. But when Recall processed your screenshots, when it converted those images into searchable text, the content passed through a state where it existed outside the protection of that locked memory before being written to storage. Brief, measurable. Hagener put it this way: the vault is rock solid. The wall next to it is drywall. Take a moment with that image. Microsoft had built an exceptionally strong container. The architecture required the content to pass outside it, briefly, to function at all. To change that would mean changing what Recall fundamentally is. Beaumont, who had watched this longer than almost anyone, put it carefully: the efforts were real. Which brings me to the question I find hardest to sit with, not whether Microsoft tried, but why the original version shipped the way it did, given what we know about what they already knew. Benicam Moransivak, Satya Nadella, had been saying "do security" for years before Recall launched. Those words appear in internal communications that became public. The principle was stated. The priority was declared. Recall shipped anyway. After the delay, the scrutiny, and the regulatory inquiries, Microsoft responded with something larger than a patch. They reorganized around the problem. 34,000 engineers were moved to security work. Not a fix, a restructuring of how the entire company treats security as a discipline, announced by the same CEO who had been saying, "do security" for years before any of this happened. I've spent a long time thinking about how to explain the gap between those two things, and the most honest answer I have is I'm not sure I would have done differently. If you were a product manager at Microsoft in late 2023, sitting on a feature your CEO had publicly championed, that hardware partners had built entire product lines around, that represented the most visible proof of an $80 billion bet. What is the calculation on raising a flag? It's not that the engineers didn't know. Some of them almost certainly did. Beaumont's concerns weren't novel. They were the kind of concerns that appear in security reviews when a system is designed to capture and index everything a computer does. The question isn't whether anyone knew. The question is whether the system made it possible for what they knew to change the outcome. That's what a room does. Everyone in it learns from each other that this is important enough, viable enough, secure enough, because the room needs it to be. Not because anyone lied. Because everyone in that room had already committed to a version of reality in which Recall shipped. 34,000 engineers after the fact. The intent was real. The effort was real. And the product shipped the way it did, from a company that knew what it was building, in an organization that had already declared security a priority, because the system that produced it was never actually organized around the question of whether it should. Signal still blocks Windows Recall by default. Not as a statement, not as a publicity move, as a security decision the engineering team made, documented, and shipped, and has not reversed. That detail has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story. Because Signal doesn't need to do this. The rebuilt Recall is opt-in. The encryption is real. The authentication is real. A user who enables Recall and grants it permission to capture their screen has, in some meaningful sense, consented. Signal looked at all of that and blocked it anyway. Signal helped pressure Microsoft into building something genuinely more secure. Signal's public refusal in May 2025 was part of what made the security failures impossible to dismiss. Microsoft rebuilt. The vault became real. Then Signal looked at what Microsoft built and said, no. I've been sitting with that for a while. The question the original Recall raised was about privacy, whether Microsoft should be capturing everything you do on your computer by default. That question got answered. Microsoft changed course. They built the opt-in version. They built the enclave. They built the authentication. The question that remains is different. It's not about what the system does. It's about whether the people who understand systems like this, who have spent years thinking carefully about what surveillance architecture can do, about what access means, about the distance between technically secure and actually safe, whether those people trust it. Right now, they don't. I don't know if that gap closes. Weston's team has demonstrated they can build serious architecture when given the mandate. The technical problems may be solvable. But trust doesn't follow from technical correctness. It follows from a track record. And this feature, specifically, this feature, doesn't have one yet. The question was never whether users could opt out. It was whether the people who understand this best would opt in. They haven't. That's not a verdict on Microsoft. It's not a verdict on recall. It's a question about what this category of feature, AI systems that learn from everything you do, that index your behavior, that make your past searchable to your future self. What it would actually take for the people who think hardest about trust to say yes. We don't know the answer to that yet, but I think it's worth knowing which people are still saying no and why.